Welcome to Mount Nebo. If these stones could talk, we are looking out over the ruins of an ancient Byzantine monastery that was constructed next to the ancient Byzantine church here on the top of Mount Nebo. So we just left Mount Hor in the south in the desert where his tomb is, where he passed away, and we've made it here to Mount Nebo. And this is a place where Moses died, looking out over the promised land. In fact, usually there's such a beautiful view into what they call the west bank of the Jordan, because we are on the eastern bank of the Jordan on this tall mountain. And I would like to talk a little bit today about the seventh commandment and how it speaks about solidarity. Solidarity is something, and community life is something that the monks practiced beautifully because they wanted to fulfill the covenant. They wanted to be free in the law of the Lord, free in his love. And so let's talk more about that from this mountaintop. We're 23,000 feet above sea level, by the way. So this day is cloudy and chilly. In fact, they had some snow over in Amman also recently. So let's go inside and talk more about the seventh commandment and solidarity. So follow me. So we have the great privilege being inside this incredible archaeological site to actually be within the structure of the ancient Byzantine church. In fact, they built several churches here at that time. And one of the first things people notice, of course, are the incredible mosaics all over the place. But before I talk about those, one of the things that people notice as they go up the main aisle is a hole. In fact, if you look down into it, it's shaped like a tomb. And so many people have said, oh, that's the tomb of Moses. Well, we know very well that he was here around the 1300s with the chosen people. They were looking out into the promised land. But what happened here? I think it would be worthwhile to read from Deuteronomy chapter 34 at the very beginning. And this is what it says. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. We can actually see it right here. I'm looking out the door. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region of the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And then in verse 5 it says, Moses, a servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. And so it's interesting, of course, there's a lot of theories here. Some of the Muslims on the other side of the Jordan say they know where his tomb is. But here in Scripture it says nobody knows. No one knows. And so when they were doing excavations, they found a lot of tombs underneath the main altar, certainly from the monks who lived here, I would imagine. This was also a place of many hermitages where the monks in community would live for a while in solitude and probably come back for Mass. But here, finding a tomb without bones in it, perhaps it was on purpose. Perhaps it was just never used, but perhaps it was on purpose to remind us that although Moses died here, we don't know where he was buried. Now, one of the first witnesses to this place, as she was a witness to so many places in the Holy Land, was that Spanish pilgrim named Egeria. And this is what she says. When she came here, she had her diary, and she wrote this. We reached the top of that mountain, where there is now a church of no great size, on the summit of Mount Nebo, and inside where the pulpit is, I saw a slightly raised place about the size of a normal tomb. I asked about it, and the holy men replied, Holy Moses was buried here by angels, since the Bible tells us no human being knoweth his burial. And there's no doubt that it was angels who buried him, since the actual tomb where he was buried can be seen today. Our predecessors here pointed out this place to us, and now we point it out to you. And so then she says they prayed for one another, and then we left the church. They pray psalms, they read the scriptures, everything that they do on their pilgrim journey. And so we're very happy to point it out to you as well. So when was this church built? Well, Egeria, she actually came at the end of the 4th century. At the end of the 300s, she was here. So that first church was already here, just like so many churches in the Holy Land. Work of St. Helen, work of the Romans who came in, who became Christian and said, these are so sacred to us that we want to make sure that they're kept well. It was expanded twice at the beginning of the 6th, in other words, beginning in the 500s and the end of the 500s. And that's why you can see so many different types of mosaics. And I think it's brilliant, thanks to the Franciscans and their wonderful archaeology, what they've done to show us. Because you see some mosaics on the floor level. There's actually 3 levels of the church. But then you see mosaics that are on the wall. And those mosaics on the wall were actually found on top of the ones that you see on the ground right now, because the ones on the ground are older. And that way they were protected. And especially over in the baptistry right across from me, it's just a remarkable mosaic, probably the best preserved mosaic in this area, showing a lot of different animals, a lot of different peoples. You see an ostrich with an African man, and then you see a couple of other animals, including what looks like a camel with spots. Maybe that's a giraffe, maybe not, but the person who's holding it actually has Persian headdress. But then you see animals from all over the place. What is that mosaic telling us? It's talking about solidarity. It's talking about what happens with baptism. We are all created into one family, and we're all called to be brothers and sisters. We're all called to live in a society where all of us have the same dignity in him. And this was really fulfilled in Christ, but the 7th commandment, and actually all of the commandments from the 4th to the 10th, give us guidelines to live that. And it's in the grace of Christ Jesus that we're able to. And that's why I think it's perfect. That's a baptismal chapel. So it's very typical of Byzantine churches, you may know this, but not only to have the church, but to have a monastery next to it, a place where they have a hospital, also a place for pilgrims, because it is, again, to gather in this family, gather in the family of the faith, to care for pilgrims, to pray with them, and to maintain the places which are sacred. So perhaps some of you have heard even later of, in the Crusaders, there was a group called the Hospitallers. So what would they have done? They took care of the pilgrims. Going on a pilgrim journey back then was really difficult. It may not have been the 40 years that the ancient Israelites, went through the desert. But the point of that pilgrimage, just like the point of our Lenten pilgrimage, is to obtain freedom. Freedom from sin, freedom from vice, freedom to be able to forgive, to enter into a true life of spirituality. All of this has to do with our pilgrimage and what they would do throughout the centuries here. So this is true solidarity, because solidarity it's a means to freedom, but most especially, it's actually a fruit of freedom. And so this is a lesson which I think the Israelites had to live as they were going through the desert, trying to understand what this law was that they agreed to live. All right, so what is the 7th commandment? Let's just remind ourselves, since we were in a completely different part of the country just yesterday. You shall not steal, is what it says. You shall not steal. It's, not unjustly taking or keeping the goods of one's neighbor. But the point is, the depth of this is living justice and charity in the care of earthly goods. And these are really the fruits of men's labor. And so that's why this particular commandment has so many nuances. And I'm going to start with an easy one, especially as we look at the mosaics on the floor here. Just behind me in this beautiful baptismal chapel, you see just gorgeous flora and fauna. And the one also, this is actually called the Church of the Theotokos, by the way. So that means, the God-bearer. This would be Mary, But then behind us, there's another baptismal chapel. Sorry, this is a normal chapel. The baptismal chapel is behind us. Just the beauty of the grapes, of the birds, of the animals. Well, it points us to one of the nuances of this commandment, and that is care for animals. animals, plants, inanimate objects, they're all destined for the common good. And that's why I think Greta Thunberg, the generation right now who's so concerned about climate change and ecology and the environment, they have a point. This is exactly what the commandment is talking about. To take care of all of these things, because they're all created goods. We're called to be stewards of them, not just for now, but it's also stewards of the past, like the Franciscans do such a beautiful job of, but also the environment for the future. That's actually solidarity. That's part of what this commandment is talking about. And one of the things that we have to remember is in man's dominion over the earth, as it says in Genesis 1, our dominion over inanimate and other living beings is not absolute. Obviously, it's in function of the quality of life of my neighbor. Now, in terms of animals, we have to be a little bit careful because we love them. I love dogs, for example. Dog, spelled backward, God. God gave us dogs. I just think dogs are extraordinary. And so their mere existence in that sense gives glory to God, because it also gives delight to man. And when man is delighted, when we are delighted, certainly the Lord is glorified. So we owe them kindness. Not all of us can be like St. Francis of Assisi that can talk to wolves, but certainly we can follow in his footsteps of recognizing that even more than a stone or something inanimate or a plant, they have a greater dignity. So they're entrusted to our stewardship, and that means they also are in function of the good for mankind. They can be used for food. They can be used for clothing. They can be used for work. I love sheepdogs. They're incredibly intelligent. They can be used for leisure, like a lap dog that makes you happy. And they can also be used for medical and scientific experimentation when you're not torturing those animals. That goes against our nature, not just theirs. And so these are things to keep in mind. So there's no reason, and certainly it's against, strangely enough, against the seventh commandment to say, it's okay to torture an animal, which it is not. Nor is it proper to spend an excessive amount of money on dogs or pets as if they're children. That's giving our affection to something that is only due to other people. That's actually an aberration. So that's the first nuance I wanted to talk about. But when we get into the temporal order, if we're talking about purity of heart, which is part of what this commandment deals with, the pure of heart will see God, and that means his kingdom. When we're trying to build the kingdom here in our lives, there's a lot of things to take into account, and we can't all be monks, right? But they gave us a really good example of social doctrine of the church when it has to do with the economy. And that simply means the laws of social living. When did the social doctrine of the church come about? Doctrine simply means teachings. It's from a reflection in prayer on this commandment and several others on the second tablet about the social life and social living. And it came out in the 1800s because it was, after the Industrial Revolution, it was still, in full force. There was a lot of child labor, there was overworking, there was a lot of just profit seeking. So what does that have to do with stealing? Well, there's a lot that's involved there. Again, according to this commandment, we have to live it according to the demands of justice and peace. And it's actually the lay people, each and every one of you, that's called to order, we could say, the economic world according to justice and peace. What are the principles that that the commandment tells us? Well, first of all, principles for reflection, so to enlighten our mind, criteria for judgment, so we're not just kind of pulled along by any system, and certainly guidelines for action. So very clearly, when we're talking about social relationships, there's a lot about them which is determined by economic factors. But neither capitalism, nor socialism, nor communism are praised by the church. We're not a political place. This is not what these monks were doing. They were giving an example of peace and justice, absolutely. But the most important thing is that the theory which makes profit the most important thing is completely morally unacceptable, because suddenly man is a means to an end and not an end in himself. As it says very clearly in Matthew 6, you cannot serve God and serve mammon. But we all need money. We all are within a social economic system. So what are we supposed to do? First of all, remember that there are many human needs which cannot be satisfied through the market, through economy. So that's one of the first bases of this. But what about economic activity in itself? The development of economic activity and growth in production are meant to provide for the needs of human beings. So that's the principle right there. It's not meant, the economic life, solely to multiply goods produced to increase profit and power. That's very clear. We'll talk about that more as we continue on with the commandments. But it's ordered, first of all, to the service of persons, all mankind, and the entire human community. It becomes so evident now in a global society. That's exactly what we see all the time. So what are the applications of this in my life when we're trying to hear what the Spirit is telling us so that we can go out from sin and enter into freedom? First of all, in the area of human work. Go back to the office. Remote work is so nice. Is there dignity in work? Immense dignity in work. Persons were all created in the image of and likeness of God, and he said to go and subdue the earth. Subdue it. Both with and for one another. That's where the solidarity comes in. In fact, St. Paul himself says in 2 Thessalonians, if anyone will not work, he shall not eat. It's something that we've forgotten in our day and age. But the Creator's gifts and talents that we received from him should be put at the service of others. That's part of solidarity. And that can also be extremely redemptive. Again, we can go back to the example of Tiny Tim and Cratchit, He was redemptive. He was very smart in using his goods to help others, and that redeemed him. It helped him to live that life of grace. And also we have to always remember that Jesus, his father Joseph, they were carpenters. He was a worker. And so it kind of brings us to that idea of carrying the cross daily. That's part of our work. It's part of our work and part of our dignity. Together with that, of course, is the idea that we should be able to draw from our work the means for providing our life. That's the whole issue of just wages. It's really hard sometimes in different countries. It's just different. There's different costs of living. But there's a huge dimension there, especially if you're a business owner or you have employees, of just wages. What about another one? Another implication. It's the right of economic initiative. I'll start my business. I'll sell some lollipops, make some money. Everyone should have the right to make a legitimate use of his talents. And it's not just for his own abundance, but when lived in a Christian way, building the kingdom and living solidarity, it means I want to produce more for the good of everyone. So it's for the benefit of everyone. Another implication, what are the responsibilities of the state regarding economy? Well, they need to guarantee individual freedom and private property. We talked about that. As well as a stable currency. Isn't that interesting? That's where they go. That's what they're supposed to do in the political sphere. And the principal task of the state, in that sense, is to guarantee security so that those who work and produce can enjoy the fruits of their labors and share it with others. That's what it means to live solidarity. How about for business enterprises? What about for them? Economic and ecological effects of their operations need to be taken into account. It's that whole stewardship of the environment. So they need to consider the good of persons and not just increasing profits. That's just logical. What about another point? Access to employment. Professions must be open to all. I love this. Without unjust discrimination from men or women, healthy, disabled, natives, or immigrants. Part of the civil society is to help people find work. And I love this here. In this working or living monastery right now on Mount Nebo, as well as in the other monasteries of the Franciscans, they always seek to provide work for the local people. The Bedouins take beautiful care of this place. We have to remember that the Muslims also said that this place is where Moses died, most of them. So yeah, there's a huge tradition here. It's part of their culture and part of their heritage. And just like at St. Catherine's down in Sinai, they all work together. So access to employment. And as I had mentioned, of course, the just wage. In fact, I just wanted to point out that withholding wages is actually completely unjust. It could be a very grave injustice because you're actually not just hurting one person, their livelihood, but also the livelihood of their families and the benefit of all society. So this is extremely important. And wages, just wages, isn't just money. This commandment tells us to speak of or tells us to live in justice and peace. That means providing a dignified livelihood. The wage has to help for the dignified livelihood of people. In the material, social, cultural. Cultural means school. That was part of the problem with the Industrial Revolution. These kids weren't going to school. They weren't learning. And it was enslaving them in many ways. And also at a spiritual level, this is what it means to have just wages in all of those different dimensions. This commandment even deals with strikes. Strikes are fine as long as it's for, not violent and you're looking for a proportional good that can't be obtained otherwise. But it can't be manipulated. Objectives that are not directly toward good working conditions, that's unacceptable. But whatever helps the common good. All right, so let's finish talking about justice and solidarity among nations, just like these beautiful mosaics show us that the whole human family is called to be one. Well, the solidarity among nations is a big deal. The rich nations, the poor nations, those that live in absolute misery. Well, the church actually tells us something, I think, which is strong but very true. It's a question of dismantling perverse mechanisms. They're completely twisted that impede the development of less advanced countries. What are some of those things? Well, financial systems that are usurious. In other words, they have so much, extra that you have to pay when you take out a loan that you're just getting stuck in debt, and then you're becoming slave. You become a slave to your brother. That's not free. Even things like iniquitous commercial relations among nations, there's just lack of clarity there. When there's the labor, which is more like slave labor, this happens so often. We've got to be so careful even with the products that we buy. The arms race, we're smart enough and we're intelligent enough, good enough to be able to work together to develop all of these things for the good of each person. So in that sense, what do rich nations have to do? Give money to poor nations? Aid is definitely something which is encouraged. Helping the poor is always wonderful. But reforming international economic and financial institutions to better promote equitable relationships with less advanced countries, that's what you can do, especially in agriculture and in labor. But with rich nations, they have a grave moral responsibility towards those which are unable to ensure the means of their development by themselves, or have been prevented from doing so by tragic historical events. Okay, immediately in your mind you're going to come with, reparations, this is a reparation idea. Well, what is true reparation? True reparation doesn't mean just pouring money into people or into nations. It means doing everything that you can so that they themselves can develop as well. All of these goods that, the benefits that we're producing, let's not produce less. Let's actually use them to help them also to produce for themselves. That is what this commandment is inviting us to do. That's how we don't steal from one another. There's just so much nuance here. In addition, I just have to mention this, it's a respect for cultural identities and openness to the transcendent. So this is our vocation. This is the call that the Lord is making to us, really following the example of the monks who lived right here. But again, this being leaven in the mass and changing temporal realities, this depends on the lay people. Witnesses in what you do to be agents of peace and justice. And as I alluded to, I just want to end by saying love for the poor. It's always a preferential option for the church. It's what monasteries dedicate themselves to in many ways. But we know very well that God blesses those that come to the aid of the poor. In fact, he made this a challenge, even for the chosen people. This is actually what it says in the Old Testament. It says in Deuteronomy 15, "For the poor will never cease out of the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in the land." So this is why when Jesus said, "The poor you will always have with you, but you do not always have me," in John 12, just continues on with this. This is why also they had the Jubilee, years of forgiveness, where also they would return their land. They wouldn't, it was prohibited actually to lend money for profit, for interest, all of those things, keeping collateral. All of that was actually, the chosen people were said, don't do this. And they needed to have these guidelines as they were coming from here, leaving Moses, who had died, and going across the Jordan and into the promised land. This is how they were to remain free. So at this point, I would like to invite each of you to take out your personal 10 Commandments. So I look at some of the beautiful things around me. And as we go to the 7th commandment, ask ourselves the question, where is the Lord calling me to live greater solidarity? What do I have to go out from? What do I have to enter into? Is it caring for the poor? Is it caring for them at a material level, at a cultural level, and a religious level? How is it that I should not steal from them what has been given to me? Maybe I'm supposed to produce more, work better. These are things that only you can hear from the Lord. So ask him in prayer. And know that from here, this beautiful place, this gorgeous, historic place that's still alive with liturgical life and with the life of monks, know that we're praying for you from here. And we hope you can join us again tomorrow as we continue our pilgrimage of freedom through the Holy Land. And God bless you.